Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are going to do something a little bit different. We are going to try to look behind one of the most famous masks in American history.
And you mean that in the most literal sense possible.
I do, I really do. I'm talking about a mask of mascara and false eyelashes and, that tattooed on permanent eyeliner. We are talking about Tammy Faye Messner, formerly Bakker.
Yeah, and that name, for anyone who lived through the 80s, it just instantly conjures this very specific image.
Oh, 100%.
And usually it's a caricature, right? It's the crying woman on the news, standing next to her disgraced preacher husband. She was the punchline of 1,000 late-night monologues.
Exactly. If you grew up in the 80s or 90s, she was basically a walking cartoon character. But the thing is, the more I looked into the stack of research we have for today, the more I realized that the cartoon version is, well, it's just not the whole story. It's boring even. The real story is so much weirder and darker and honestly a lot more inspiring than I ever would have expected.
It is a story of extremes. I mean, you have extreme poverty, then this unbelievable extreme wealth. You have extreme faith, and then this just colossal scandal.
And then a third act that nobody saw coming.
The incredible third act of redemption.
Yeah.
It's not just a story about a televangelist. It's really a story about American culture, about the media, and how we treat women who are just maybe a little too loud or take up too much space.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. So we've got a massive stack of records to get through today. Biographies, court documents, we have transcripts of old Larry King interviews, which are fascinating, and even accounts from reality TV show tapings.
Right.
And our mission today is to try and figure out how a girl from the freezing cold border of Minnesota co-built a multi-million-dollar religious empire, watched it all burn to the ground in this spectacular ball of fire, and then somehow emerged from the ashes as a gay icon and a beloved pop culture figure.
It's an incredible arc, and along the way we really have to unpack the prosperity gospel, which is a huge piece of this. We have to talk about the cultural panic around AIDS in the 1980s and just the bizarre psychology of living your entire life. I mean, even your darkest, most humiliating moments in front of a television camera.
I'm really interested in the whole air-conditioned doghouse side of things, just the sheer drama of it all.
And for me, it's analyzing how she really deviated from those traditional evangelical gender roles. She was not the quiet wife standing in the background.
Not at all. So let's start at the very beginning. Before the gold-plated bathrooms, before the theme park, let's go to International Falls, Minnesota.
The icebox of the nation.
I've never been, but the name alone just makes me want to put on a sweater.
It's brutal. I mean, we are talking about a town on the Canadian border where winter lasts for what feels like half the year. Tammy Faye was born there in 1942 as Tammy Faye LaValle.
Okay.
And to really understand her, I think you have to understand the isolation of a place like that. In the 1940s, International Falls wasn't just cold. It was, it was disconnected from the rest of the world.
And from what I read, her home life wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy either, was it?
No, it wasn't. And this is a really crucial piece of psychological context for everything that comes later. Her mother, Rachel Minnie, had a very, very difficult life. She was a dedicated homemaker, but she'd gone through a really painful divorce shortly after Tammy was born.
Which today, a divorce is, it's common, but we're talking about a very conservative religious community in the early 1940s. That's a huge scandal.
Oh, it's a scarlet letter. Absolutely. And the fallout from that divorce deeply, deeply affected Tammy's mother. The records show that the whole experience soured her mother against ministers.
Wow.
She felt alienated by the church. She felt judged. So Tammy grows up in this house where the institutional church is viewed with deep suspicion, if not, outright hostility, by the most important person in her world.
Which is such a massive irony when you think about it. The woman who would go on to become one of the most famous televangelists in history was raised by a woman who just did not trust preachers.
It creates this fascinating tension right from the start, doesn't it? Tammy is the eldest in a large blended family. Both her parents remarried, and she has all this responsibility. But she also has this innate magnetic pull toward the very thing her mother distrusts, the altar.
Right.
She talks about feeling the spirit at a really young age. It was almost an act of rebellion for her to become so deeply religious.
That's a really interesting take. Religion as teenage rebellion. Usually it's rock and roll or sneaking cigarettes. For Tammy Faye, it was speaking in tongues.
Precisely. And that drive, that ambition, it took her out of the icebox and down to Minneapolis to North Central Bible College in 1960.
Okay.
She was trying to make ends meet, working in a boutique. And this is where the movie really starts. This is the moment she meets Jim Bakker.
The big meet cute.
It really was. Jim was a student there, too, and he was working at a restaurant inside a department store. They met in 1960, and the chemistry must have been just, I don't know, nuclear. Because they did not waste any time. They got married on April Fool's Day, 1961.
April Fool's Day. You really can't write this stuff better than reality does.
It's a detail that biographers always point out. It just feels like this giant piece of foreshadowing.
Yeah, it really does.
But at the time, of course, it was just young love. They actually dropped out of Bible college to get married. They chose each other over their formal education, and almost immediately they hit the road.
Right. This is the itinerant preacher phase. I have this mental image of them in a beat-up old car, just driving from one tiny church basement to the next.
That is pretty much spot on. They were traveling evangelists. Jim would preach, and Tammy was the secret weapon. She played the accordion, and she sang.
The accordion. You don't see a lot of accordion in modern worship bands, do you?
No, you do not. It was very of its time, very down home. But it signaled something really important about them. They weren't just theologians. They were entertainers. They understood that to keep people engaged, especially in these small rural churches, you had to put on a show.
But the accordion wasn't what launched them into the big time. It was something much, much weirder. So much weirder.
Are we about to talk about the puppets?
We are about to talk about the puppets.
Okay, I need you to explain this to me. Because when I think of televangelism, I think of these, guys in slick suits shouting about hellfire. I do not think of, what were their names? Susie Moppet.
Susie Moppet and Allied the Alligator.
Yeah.
Yes. And this is a critical part of their evolution that often gets skipped over. In the 1960s, they started working for Pat Robertson at CB and the Christian Broadcasting Network.
Right.
But they weren't hired to preach to adults. They were hired to do children's programming.
So they were basically the Christian Muppets.
In a way, yeah. They created a show called Jim and Tammy, which ran for almost a decade, from 1964 to 1973. And this experience is absolutely the key to understanding all of their future success.
How so?
Well, think about it. Working with puppets taught them how to be comfortable on camera for hours and hours at a time. It taught them how to simplify complex theological ideas into these little bite-sized, digestible nuggets. And there's a psychological safety in puppets, isn't there? You can make the puppet say things that you might be too afraid to say yourself.
100%. Tammy voiced Susie Moppet. So Susie could be sassy. Susie could ask the dumb questions about God that maybe people in the audience were thinking but were too afraid to ask. It allowed Tammy to develop this persona of the innocent inquirer. It made her incredibly relatable.
So they spent a decade doing this children's show. They're building a following. They're learning the ropes of TV production. But clearly, they had bigger ambitions than just holding a fake alligator.
Much, much bigger. In 1974, they decided to strike out on their own. They left CBN, and they briefly helped found TBN, the Trinity Broadcasting Network, but that ended pretty poorly with some infighting.
Okay.
So they moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, and they started the PTL Club.
PTL, praise the Lord.
Or People That Love. Or, as this cynical bumper stickers would later say, pass the loot.
Right.
But in 1974, it was Praise the Lord, and they set up shop in an abandoned furniture store.
I just love that detail. It's so scrappy and American.
It was. But it did not stay scrappy for very long. The growth was just... It was explosive. Within a few years, they weren't just a TV show. They were a full-blown network. They were broadcasting 24 hours a day via satellite.
Which was revolutionary at the time.
It was completely revolutionary. You have to remember, in the mid-'70s, 24-hour television just wasn't really a thing. CNN didn't even launch until 1980. The Bakkers were absolute pioneers of the 24-hour news cycle, but for Jesus.
And the money, I assume the money started pouring in.
It was a fire hose of cash, an absolute torrent. By the late 70s, the PTL Club was generating $120 million annually.
Wait, say that again? $120 million in 1970s money. That's the GDP of a small country.
It was staggering. It's almost impossible to comprehend. And this is where we have to talk about the theology that drove this engine. Because you don't make $120 million a year by telling people to sell all their possessions and live in poverty.
No, you definitely don't.
You make it by preaching what's known as the prosperity gospel.
Right. This is a term we hear thrown around a lot. But what does it actually mean in practice? Like, how did they sell this idea to people?
So the prosperity gospel, or the word of faith movement, essentially flips the traditional Christian script on its head. Historically, Christianity often viewed wealth as a spiritual danger. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle and all that.
Right. Be humble. Be poor.
The prosperity gospel says the opposite. It says that God wants you to be rich. It interprets financial success and physical health as the divine seal of approval.
So if you're driving a Cadillac, it's not because you're greedy, it's because you're incredibly faithful.
Exactly. And the flip side of that is also true, and this is the dark part. If you are poor or if you are sick, it might be because you lack faith.
Wow, that's a heavy burden to put on people.
It is. But it's also a very seductive message, especially in the economic uncertainty of the late 70s and early 80s. It told people that they had control over their destiny. If they just sowed a seed, which meant, donated money to the ministry, God would repay them 100-fold.
It's basically spiritual investment banking.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
And the Bakkers embodied this completely. Their show mixed this glitzy entertainment with down-home family values. They didn't hide their wealth. They flaunted it as proof of God's blessing.
The flashy suits, the gold jewelry.
The sets that looked more like the Tonight Show than a church service, it was all part of the testimony.
And right in the center of this gold-plated stage was Tammy Faye.
She was the heart of the entire operation. Jim was the visionary. He was the builder. He was the guy asking for the money. But Tammy was the emotional connection, and she was totally unlike any other televangelist wife of that era.
How so? What made her different?
Well, think about the other major figures of that time. Mrs. Falwell, Mrs. Robertson. They were very traditional, very demure.
Right. They stood in the background and smiled.
They smiled at me. They played the piano. They were silent partners. Tammy was loud. She was 4 feet 11 inches of pure, unadulterated energy. She was on screen just as much as Jim was.
And she wasn't talking about baking cookies.
Oh, no. She was breaking taboos left and right.
Yeah.
She talked openly about her marriage struggles. She talked about sex. There is a famous clip where she discusses penile implants on air.
I'm sorry, she discussed what on a Christian network?
Penile implants on a Christian network in the 1980s. Her intention was to help couples who were, struggling with intimacy. But you can just imagine the shockwaves that sent through the fundamentalist community.
I can't even imagine.
She even admitted to her own prescription drug addiction and her treatment for it in 1987. She just made the private completely public.
And the makeup. We have to talk about the makeup. It wasn't just a little lipstick and powder. It was the construction.
It was her armor. Huh? The heavy foundation, the tattooed eyeliner, the famous spider leg eyelashes. People mocked her for it relentlessly. They called her a clown. But for her fans, that excess actually made her more accessible. It signaled that she wasn't perfect, that she was trying hard, that she was covering up insecurities just like they were.
She was sort of the patron saint of being too much.
She absolutely was. And that emotional rawness, that willingness to be vulnerable, led to what I consider the single most important moment of her entire career at PTL. It wasn't a sermon. It was an interview.
You're talking about Steve Peters.
Yes. And we really need to set the scene here. It's 1985. The AIDS epidemic is absolutely ravaging the country. And the stigma is, it's suffocating.
It's hard to even explain to people who weren't there. People were terrified to touch doorknobs. Families were disowning their own children. And the church, the evangelical church, was largely leading the charge of hate and judgment.
Jerry Falwell was on the record famously saying AIDS was God's judgment on homosexuals. That was the prevailing narrative in their world. And then on the PTL network, broadcasting into millions of conservative Christian living rooms, Tammy Faye brings out Stephen Peters,
who was a day Christian minister living with AIDS.
And he was visibly sick. He had Kaposi's sarcoma lesions on his face, and Tammy didn't recoil from him. She didn't lecture him. She didn't tell him to repent for his sins.
No.
She leaned in. She cried with him. They talked about his faith. They talked about the death of his partner. And then she turned to the camera and she delivered a monologue that was absolutely radical for that time and for that place.
I have the quote right here. She said, "How sad that we as Christians, who are to be the salt of the earth, we who are supposed to be able to love everyone, are afraid so badly of an AIDS patient that we will not go up and put our arm around them and tell them that we care."
And tell them that we care. It was a direct challenge to her own audience. She was essentially telling them that their fear was unchristian, that their judgment was wrong.
That moment alone just separates her from the entire rest of the televangelist pack.
It does. It showed that her empathy was fundamentally stronger than her dogma. And ironically, it was that empathy that would end up saving her later when the church itself turned its back on her.
But before we can get to the redemption, we have to go through the fire. We have to talk about Heritage USA and the collapse.
Yep.
Because they didn't just build a TV studio, they built a Disneyland for Christians.
Heritage USA.
Hmm.
It was located in Fort Mill, South Carolina. And Disneyland for Christians is not an exaggeration. At its peak, it was the third most visited theme park in the entire United States,
God.
behind only Disney World and Disneyland.
That is a mind-blowing statistic. It's just hard to wrap my head around what was actually there. What did you do at Heritage USA?
Everything.
Yeah.
Absolutely everything. There was a massive water park. There was a shopping mall designed to look like a Victorian village, but it was indoors and air-conditioned. There's a huge hotel called the Heritage Grand,
Huh.
a retreat center, replicas of the upper room chapels from Jerusalem. It was a completely immersive environment where you could be entertained and spend money without ever having to encounter the world.
It sounds incredibly expensive.
It was incredibly expensive to build and to run, and this is where the prosperity gospel turned into what was, for all intents and purposes, a Ponzi scheme.
Okay, break that down. How did that happen?
They needed a constant flow of cash to keep building, so they came up with this idea to sell lifetime partnerships. For a donation of, say, $1,000, you were promised 3 nights a year at the Heritage Grand Hotel for the rest of your life.
This sounds like a pretty great deal for the donor.
It was a fantastic deal for the donor. It was a terrible deal for the ministry because it created this massive future liability that they could never possibly sustain. But the real fraud was in the math.
Oh.
They sold tens of thousands more of these partnerships than they had hotel rooms. They oversold the hotel by something like 800%.
So they were just taking money for rooms that literally did not exist.
Exactly. It was a classic Ponzi structure. They were using the new money from new partners to pay the operating costs and the promises made to the old partners.
Mm.
It was a house of cards. And the wind that finally blew it all down came from a very specific direction.
1987, the year everything changed.
The catalyst was a sex scandal. But really, it was always about the money. In 1987, it was revealed that PTL had paid $287,000 to buy the silence of a woman named Jessica Hahn.
Now, the details of this encounter they're very disputed.
Highly disputed. Jessica Hahn was a church secretary from New York. She claimed that back in 1980, Jim Bakker and another preacher, John Wesley Fletcher, drugged and raped her in a hotel room in Florida.
But that wasn't Jim Bakker's version of the story.
No. In his later book, which was titled I Was Wrong, Jim Bakker claimed he was set up and that the encounter was consensual, though he did admit it was a terrible sin that he regretted.
But regardless of what actually happened in that room, it was the cover-up. The cover-up is what exploded the bomb.
Yes. PTL paid her off to stay quiet, and when that payment came to light, it opened the books. And once the books were open, the financial fraud was just undeniable.
And the media frenzy was unlike anything people had really seen before. This was pre-internet, but it was wall-to-wall coverage. It was on the cover of Time, Newsweek, every single nightly news broadcast.
The public was completely obsessed, and I think they were obsessed with the hypocrisy of it all. Here were these people preaching holiness and sacrifice, yet living in this absolute, unbelievable opulence on the backs of, grandmothers' Social Security checks.
And the symbol of that opulence became the doghouse.
The infamous air-conditioned doghouse.
You have to describe this. It's just so perfect.
So, at their massive lakefront home in Tega Cay, South Carolina, which was already a mansion, they had a doghouse for their pets that was fully heated in the winter and fully air-conditioned in the summer.
All while people were sending in their last $20 to help build God's kingdom.
Exactly. It became the perfect metaphor for their complete disconnect from the reality of their followers' lives. And Tammy, bless her heart, did not help matters at all.
No, she did not.
When reporters cornered her and asked about their lavish lifestyle, she said, and this is direct quote, "We don't get what Johnny Carson makes, and we work a lot harder than him."
Oh, Tammy, that is a lack of reading the room on a galactic scale.
She truly believed it, though. That's the thing. In her mind, she saw herself as an entertainer on the same level as Johnny Carson. But the public did not see it that way. They saw a grift.
So the empire collapses. PTL goes bankrupt. But there's another villain in the shadows here, isn't there? Someone who kind of swooped in to pick at the bones.
Jerry Falwell. And the irony here is just so thick. When the scandal first broke, Jim Bakker actually entrusted the entire ministry to Jerry Falwell. He thought Falwell, a fellow preacher, would hold it together until the storm passed.
That's like entrusting your sheep to the wolf.
It was a fatal miscalculation.
Oh.
Falwell was a strict fundamentalist. He hated the PTL style, the charismatic theology, the contemporary music, the women wearing makeup. He had called the Bakkers a cancer on the body of Christ.
Oh.
So he took over the ministry and effectively dismantled it from the inside out. There's this bizarre image of him going down the giant water slide at Heritage USA in his full suit and tie. He was essentially burying the Bakkers and everything they had built.
So Jim goes to court.
And it was an absolute circus. In 1989, Jim Bakker was indicted on 24 counts of fraud and conspiracy. The trial was a media sensation. And in the end, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison.
45 years. That is basically a life sentence.
It was. It was eventually reduced, and he ended up serving about 5 years. But at that moment, when the gavel came down, it felt like the end of the world for them. And through all of this, Tammy was there, standing right outside the courthouse.
We've all seen that footage, her, the tears streaming down her face, mascara running everywhere, singing, "On Christ the solid rock I stand." It was just, it was pathetic, but also kind of heartbreakingly loyal.
It was. She stood by him. But loyalty has a breaking point. And this brings us to the next very painful chapter of her life, the divorce.
So Jim goes to prison. Tammy is left with absolutely nothing. No money, no home, no TV show. And for a while, she does try to stick it out.
She did. She moved to Florida. She tried to keep a low profile, which is not something she was good at. But in 1992, she filed for divorce. And her reasoning was incredibly poignant and revealing.
What did she say?
She wrote a letter to her new church in Orlando. And in it, she wrote, "For years, I have been pretending that everything is all right. I cannot pretend anymore."
I cannot pretend anymore. That feels like the first completely honest thing she'd probably said in public in 20 years.
It was the moment the mask finally slipped. The character of the happy televangelist's wife was dead. She was just a woman who was tired and broke and incredibly lonely.
But she didn't stay lonely for long, and this is where the story takes a twist that feels like it was written for a soap opera. She gets remarried. To whom?
To a man named Roe Messner.
And who is Roe Messner in this universe? He's not just some random guy.
Not at all. He is not a stranger to this story. Roe was the property developer who physically built Heritage USA. He was one of Jim's best friends in the business world. He was the guy who constructed the empire.
Okay, that's already incredibly messy. But it gets even messier, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. Because Roe Messner was the man who actually wrote the check for the $287,000 in hush money to Jessica Hahn.
Wait, just to be clear. She divorced the husband who allegedly had the affair, and then she married the man who paid the hush money for that affair.
That is 100% correct.
The Thanksgiving dinners must have been just a little bit awkward.
You would think so. Now, to be fair to Roe, he always testified that he didn't really know the specifics of why the money was being paid, that he was just following Jim's orders to handle a problem. But yes, the optics were just wild.
And the drama didn't stop with the wedding, because Roe had his own set of legal problems brewing.
Of course he did.
Of course.
In 1996, Roe himself was convicted of bankruptcy fraud. He owed nearly $30 million to creditors, a lot of it stemming from the collapse of Heritage USA. He was sentenced to 27 months in federal prison.
Let's just picture this timeline for a second. Jim Bakker gets out of jail, and almost immediately, Tammy's new husband, Roe, goes into jail.
She essentially traded one inmate for another. It was this bizarre revolving door of incarceration. And once again, Tammy was left on the outside, alone and broke.
Most people would have crumbled at that point. Most people would have changed their name and moved to a cabin in Montana and just disappeared. But this is the deep dive into Tammy Faye. She didn't hide. She pivoted.
She completely reinvented herself. And she did it by leaning into the very things that people had always mocked her for. She realized that while the evangelical church had completely rejected her, there was another community out there that knew exactly what it felt like to be judged and rejected and mocked for being too much.
The LGBTQ+ community.
Exactly. And this is part 5 of our story, the unlikely emergence of a pop culture icon. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Tammy Faye Messner started appearing at gay pride marches.
I remember seeing photos of this, and it was just surreal. There's Tammy Faye with the full lashes and the big wig standing shoulder to shoulder with famous drag queens like Lady Bunny. Visually, it just made perfect sense.
It was a meeting of minds, aesthetically and spiritually. She was often referred to as the ultimate drag queen. She had the aesthetic down the camp, the drama, the exaggerated femininity. But it went so much deeper than just the look.
She refused to denounce her gay fans. That was the key.
She never did. She was asked about it constantly by conservative media who were just aghast. And she would always say, when we lost everything, it was the gay people that came to my rescue. They didn't judge me. They loved me. It was this reciprocal relationship. They saw a survivor in her. They saw someone who had been kicked out of the family but refused to die.
And this newfound popularity led to her second career in television. But this time, not on a religious network. On VH1.
The Surreal Life.
Oh my God, The Surreal Life. If you're too young to remember this show, you have to understand. It was the precursor to things like Celebrity Big Brother. They took a bunch of washed-up celebrities and put them all in a house together to see what would happen.
And the cast for Season 2 in 2004 is a pure fever dream. You have Tammy Faye Messner. You have Ron Jeremy.
Who was, at the time, the most famous male porn star in the world.
You have Vanilla Ice. You have Eric Estrada from the show Chips. You have Trishelle Cannatella from the original The Real World, Las Vegas. It's an insane combination of people.
It sounds like an absolute disaster waiting to happen. I mean, you put a Pentecostal televangelist in a house with Ron Jeremy, that should be a bloodbath.
And it's exactly what the producers wanted. They wanted conflict. They cast Tammy to be the scold, the church lady figure, who would judge everyone for their sinful ways.
But she didn't play the role they gave her.
No. She completely flipped the script again. She became the house mother. There were these incredibly tender scenes where she bonded with Vanilla Ice, of all people.
I remember that. Vanilla Ice was having this existential meltdown about his career and his reputation, and there's little Tammy Faye just comforting him and telling him it's okay.
She saw Vanilla Ice and Trishelle almost as her children.
Wow.
She understood the specific pain of being a public joke. She connected with them on the level of celebrity trauma. And it completely humanized her to a whole new generation of viewers.
Yeah.
People watched that show and thought, wait a minute, she's not a monster. She's actually really sweet and kind of funny.
She had a great sense of humor about herself by that point. She did cameos on The Drew Carey Show, playing Mimi Bobek's mother.
Which is just perfect casting.
It's genius. She was finally in on the joke. She knew the makeup was ridiculous, but she owned it. It was her brand.
And that ownership is what transformed her from a villain into a beloved icon. But there is a very dark shadow hanging over this entire period of her reinvention. While she was filming these reality shows, while she was laughing with RuPaul in documentaries, she was dying.
Yeah. This brings us to the final and really the most painful chapter of her life, her long battle with cancer.
The timeline of her illness is actually quite long. People forget that. She was first diagnosed with colon cancer all the way back in 1996.
And there is a detail in the notes here that just really stuck with me. It says the diagnosis was delayed because she was embarrassed to see a doctor.
Yes. She was having symptoms, bleeding. But she was too modest, too embarrassed to go see a male doctor. She put it off and put it off till the pain was just unbearable. It's this heartbreaking reminder of that conservative 1940s upbringing she had. Even after everything she'd been through, that shame about the body was still there.
So that cancer went into remission. But then in 2004, the same year she was on The Surreal Life, she went on Larry King Live and announced that she had lung cancer and that it was inoperable.
She and Larry King had this very special ongoing relationship. She used his show almost like her new pulpit. Whenever there was a major life update, good or bad, she went to Larry.
And she didn't hide the illness. Just like she didn't hide the tears back in the 80s. She didn't hide the effects of chemo in the 2000s.
No, she lived and she died completely in public. She shared the details of her treatment. She talked about the terrible side effects, the panic attacks. She showed the world her dramatic weight loss.
The final interview, July 18th, 2007. I watched this again to prep for this deep dive, and it is hard to get through.
It is harrowing. She weighed 65 pounds at that point. She was just skin and bone. She couldn't eat solid foods anymore. She was surviving on pudding and ice chips. But she insisted on dying that interview.
And her voice was barely a whisper. But she was still wearing the makeup. She still had the eyelashes on.
It was her war paint right until the very end. Her husband, Rose, said later that she did that interview because she wanted to say a final goodbye to her fans. She knew it was the end.
And just 2 days later, on July 20, 2007, she was gone. She died at her home in Loch Lloyd, Missouri. She was 65 years old.
A very quiet end to a very, very loud life.
But the conversation about her didn't stop when she died. In fact, her legacy has only grown and gotten more complex since then. It feels like we are in the middle of a Tammy Faye renaissance right now.
We absolutely are. There's been a significant cultural reevaluation of her life and her story. I think we as a culture collectively realize that we treated her very unfairly.
You have the 2021 film, The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Jessica Chastain played her.
And won the Oscar for Best Actress for it. That movie did a lot of heavy lifting in terms of changing the public narrative. It really portrayed her as a victim of the powerful, manipulative men around her, Jim Bakker, Jerry Falwell, and as a woman who was really ahead of her time on social issues, but was trapped in this deeply patriarchal system.
And then there are the musicals. Elton John, of all people, wrote the music for a show called Tammy Faye.
Which is just the most perfect pairing imaginable. Elton John loves a figure who is flamboyant and tragic and ultimately resilient. Tammy Faye is right in his wheelhouse.
And I have to mention this. For any Only Murders in the Building fans out there is a pig in the show named Tammy Faye Bakker.
Which I honestly think she would have loved. She wasn't precious about her image in the end. She wanted to be remembered with a smile, I think.
So we've walked through the International Falls Cold, the puppet shows, the PTL empire, the fraud, the prison sentences, the reality TV house, and the tragic end. It brings us to the big question, the final assessment. When you look at the whole picture, was she a fraud or was she a saint?
That is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the only honest answer, I think, is yes.
Well,
Both. You can't erase the fraud. She benefited from the PTL money.
yeah,
She lived in the luxury that was paid for by deception. And even if she didn't know the specific accounting details of the Ponzi scheme, she knew the money was coming from somewhere, and she spent it. She was complicit in a system that hurt a lot of people financially, but she was also a survivor. She survived what many would describe as domestic control. She survived a level of media shaming that would have absolutely destroyed most people. She survived the temporary loss of her children during the scandal. And through it all, she somehow maintained this capacity for love that is genuinely rare.
It really makes you wonder about the nature of her ministry, what it was really all about.
And that's the provocative thought I want to leave you with. When she was at the height of PTL, she had millions of viewers. She was powerful, but she was insulated. She was preaching to the choir. She was living inside a very carefully constructed bubble.
But after the scandal, after it all came crashing down,
After the scandal, when she was stripped of the gold and the theme parks and the mink coats, she was forced out into the real world. And that's when she was sitting in hospices with AIDS patients. That's when she was marching in parades with people that society had completely rejected. That's when she was comforting washed-up rappers on reality TV.
so you can make a pretty strong argument that her ministry was actually more effective after she lost the church.
Exactly. She lost the empire, but she might have found her actual calling. She died beloved by the very communities the church she helped build had condemned and rejected. In the end, she bridged a gap that almost no one else at that time could bridge.
That is a powerful and very complicated legacy. From the puppet ministry to the air-conditioned doghouse to the red carpet at the Oscars for the movie about her life, Tammy Faye Messner was a lot of things, but she was never, ever boring.
Never boring. And she never, ever took off the eyelashes.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive through all the mascara and the mess. We hope you found the very human story that was hiding underneath all those headlines.
And if this piqued your interest, seriously, go find that interview with Steve Peters. It's on YouTube. It is an absolute masterclass in empathy.
Until next time, stay curious.